Hey everyone, it's Marvin. Thanks so much for listening to Books and Boba. I just wanted to take a quick second to remind you that Books and Boba just launched our Patreon to help support our future endeavors. Rita and I have been running Books and Boba for the last 6.5 years, and we've always talked about wanting to do more, including expanding our content offerings, being able to go to book events and do more coverage. And so to help us get closer to those ambitions, we started a Patreon to help us grow and to better support books by Asian and Asian American authors. We are offering 2 tiers for our Patreon. The first is our regular Boba member coming in at $3 a month, which will give you access to our brand new Books and Boba Discord server so you can engage with your fellow Books and Boba Club members and also Rita and myself in real time. This is where we'll be aiming to move the bulk of our book club discussions, but rest assured we'll still have a presence on Goodreads as well. And our premium tier is our Honey Boba member tier coming in at $5 a month, where in addition to access to our Discord server, you'll also get access to our monthly Boba Chats, a bonus podcast where Rita and I and some guests will get together each month and have a more casual discussion on stuff that may or may not be book related, as well as answer some listener Q&A. Honey Boba members will also have access to a poll to help decide an official Books and Boba book pick once per quarter. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, support Books and Boba on Patreon by going to patreon.com/booksandboba. As always, Rita and I really appreciate your support. All right, thanks for listening, and I'm on with the show.
You're listening to Whoa! Potluck.
And hey, you're listening to Books and Boba, a book club and podcast featuring books by Asian and Asian American authors. My name is Marvin Yue.
And I'm Rita Yu.
And today we have an author interview with Rita Chang-Eppig, the author of Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea, a historical fiction novel about the infamous pirate queen Shek Yang, a.k.a. Zhang Yishao, as she's known in, I guess, Mandarin. I want to say this is our second at least featured book on our podcast about this particular pirate queen, right?
Yeah. I mean, C.B. Lee wrote a book called Clash of Steel, and we've had her on the show before, but she didn't really have Shek Yang as the main character because it was about like 2 young girls, and Shek Yang was like a mother figure, I think, in the background of the story. So quite different. And I know that because it's about a Chinese pirate queen, a lot of people might think this is like a swashbuckling, like adventure story with like cool, like it's like a cool superhero origin story. It is not that book.
It's not a One Piece.
It's not a One Piece. It's a literary novel with a lot of introspection and, political drama. So it was a little bit different from what I expected the book to be, and I was pleasantly surprised. And it's rare when we see a female protagonist be allowed to be a bad person. so that was really nice to read as well.
We had a great chat with Rita talking about how she came to writing, her inspirations for the book, and also getting into some pretty specific cultural things on like Chinese maritime culture as well. So please enjoy our chat with Rita Chang-Eppig.
And we're here with Rita Chang-Eppig, the author of Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea. Welcome to the show, Rita.
Thank you both for having me.
Yeah, very excited. We always love to start our author chats by learning more about, the people that write these books. So tell us about your journey to becoming a published novelist.
Yeah, so I will admit that I came to writing in a somewhat roundabout way. I did study creative writing in college, but at the time, this was in the early 2000s. There weren't a lot of Asian American authors who were very prominent in the literary scene. You had Amy Tan, you obviously had Maxine Hong Kingston from, years before that. But the overall message that I got around the time was that, there really wasn't room for somebody like me who wanted to tell the kinds of stories that I did as an Asian American woman. And so I after college, I actually went on to do a PhD in clinical psychology, to pay the bills, and also because I was interested in the topic. And I worked as a psychologist and adjunct psychology professor for many years before I finally decided to go back to school to get my MFA in fiction. And thankfully, things are still by no means perfect, but they are changing in my opinion. And so I did my MFA at NYU, and then I started working on this novel. I've been very fortunate in that I have found some really kind vocal supporters for my writing along the way. So I in many ways, I do owe this to the people who've helped me these past few years.
And I know that prior to writing this novel, you specialized in short stories. They've been featured on the Best American Short Stories 2021 and publications like The Rumpus. And I feel like with a lot of writing programs, they start with short stories because you can actually complete them on time. How was it? What was your experience like expanding to full novel writing? And also, was Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea your first attempt at writing a novel, or did you have a novel in your drawer?
Yeah, all great questions. So for me, expanding to a longer format was honestly kind of terrifying because, as you said, and I want to say I still love the short story form. I think there's something that short stories can do that novels just can't. And so it's a little bit like photography and oil painting. Do you know what I mean? Like they're just different art forms, and you can't really say that one art form is somehow superior to the other. But expanding to a long form was really scary because I think there are going to be many points along the way where you're going to think like, is this boring? Like, where does this go from here? Like, am I putting in too much description? Whereas with a short story, there's a kind of circumscribed, like you've got you've got about 20 pages to work with. And so whatever story you're trying to tell kind of needs to happen within those 20 pages. In sort of an answer to your second question, I did write a novel prior to this one that got published, and it will never see the light of day for, I think, everyone's sake. It should never see the light of day. But it did teach me, I think, some good lessons about how to approach Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea. And I think the primary lesson that it taught me was that I needed to, if I was starting to feel bored with my own novel, then other people were definitely going to feel bored reading my novel. And so I think it taught me some interesting things about pacing and about just kind of what do you need to do to shake up a plot or to advance characterization in a way that keeps readers engaged.
I'm curious as to like in like your MFA program, like, did you write stories about like your heritage, about like your Asian background? Because I feel like it depends on when you went for your program, because a lot of like younger Asian American writers, they have no qualms. They're like, yeah, I just wrote about my experience. I didn't really have to think about it. Whereas like older writers, they were kind of discouraged because most of the people in the room, they don't have the same experience as us. They don't look like us. So what was your experience like?
Yeah, I mean, I write I write some stories that are very much rooted in my cultural background. And then I write some stories that are about like cyborgs, so it kind of really depends on what strikes my fancy at a given moment. But it's funny because I feel like when I went to school, comments tended to fall into two kinds of categories. Like if most people were lovely. I should kind of give that, I should specify. Most people were absolutely lovely and supportive. But yeah, there are definitely people who maybe were less generous with their feedback. And they tended to fall into two categories. There are the people who are like, basically, I don't understand this culture. I don't understand what you're talking about. I remember there was one story I wrote in which about a mother and a Chinese American mother and daughter fighting. And a classmate said, like, well, I didn't empathize with either of these characters. I found I found neither of them sympathetic. And so I didn't care about the story. And it was interesting because afterward, several Asian American classmates came up to me and were like, actually, I knew exactly what you were talking about. Like, this isn't because you failed to make the story sympathetic. It's because that particular reader was not invested in sympathizing with your characters, if that makes any sense. But then on the other hand, there were also these comments where it was like, well, why are you writing about cyborgs? You should be writing about your culture, right? Like if you aren't writing about Asian things, then what's the purpose of you in the publishing industry? I mean, they didn't say it like that, but that was kind of the feeling that I walked away with. So I think I don't know. I mean, like, it's been a few years, so I don't know how MFA programs have changed in the meantime. But I do think that I was kind of coming up against both back when I was in the program.
Yeah, it definitely seems like sometimes it's similar when I speak with like Asian American creators from other mediums too. It's tough to know, like in screenwriting or in music, it's tough to know sometimes if you're there to check a box or if you're there for your art. And I think I don't know if the country is there yet because we're like, let's say like capitalism wants to exploit our cultures and our experiences for commercial gain. And sometimes they're very like, they're kind of transparent about that, right?
Oh yeah, no. Sometimes they don't even try to hide it. Like I don't know if you two are familiar with. So the author Nicole Chung wrote this piece. Yes, okay. So I see both of you nodding. And I thought, I mean, so she stated it, I think, far better than I can, which is that there's a way in which people sometimes only want to hear from us when they feel like we're there to educate them about something, right? Like that. It's like or like, oh. We want to hear about your pain, tell us about your horrible pain so that we can kind of indulge in a little bit of trauma porn. I mean, like that phrase has been floating around recently. And so, and I think as a writer, if you approach your writing trying to either match these expectations or deliberately trying to flout these expectations, I think you're going to have a very hard time writing, because then you're going to be like, there's no way you can create freely if you're kind of like navigating every step of the way, trying to avoid doing certain things or trying to match certain things. And so, yeah, I think Asian American, just general like creatives of color tend to be put in these impossible situations that we all have to kind of decide what to do about in our own ways.
Yeah, it's kind of like a damn if you do and damn if you don't. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess before we move on to your book, I'm curious about, because we've talked to a lot of authors on this podcast. Like we were mentioned, some are young and they grew up in a world where, they had people to model after to say, okay, I can't become a novelist. I want to become a writer. And then there's people that follow more of the path you took, which is a roundabout way to get into writing, kind of hedging at first because the path wasn't as clear. And then later on deciding, okay, I want to become a creative writer. For the generation of us who are in that same boat, like maybe we wanted to write at some point, but we decided, no, we're going to be a lawyer first, or we're going to be an engineer first, or what drove you? Like, do you remember what was the moment where you decided, I'm going to go back and like pursue this thing I really want to do?
I think it was less that I think it depends on how you define pursue. I kept writing after college. It just was not I just never thought that I would be able to get published. And I never, there wasn't this assumption that I think people who grew up in different circumstances have, where it's like, oh, there's going to be a market for my work, so I just need to keep writing this book until it's done, until it's ready to go out there. But I think there was a point when I hit my early to mid 30s when I realized that I had spent the past, 12 years of my life doing the thing that I felt like I should be doing, as opposed to the thing that I really wanted to do. I mean, this isn't like, I'm sure this is a story you've heard before. And I think something about that realization that, we don't know how much time any of us really has left. I should also back up a little bit and say that right around the time my mother suffered a health scare, like it was a pretty big health scare. And so I think all of those kind of made me very suddenly aware of my own mortality. And I said, okay, well, I should be clear, I didn't quit my job, right? Like I think it's a very, I think it's a very common story to be like, okay, I'm going to work at this job while pursuing my art. So I continue working as a psychologist, and I continued teaching at the university where I was teaching while doing all this writing. So it's only until very, very recently that because the demands of the book and because the demands of everything that's been happening and coming up, I was like, okay, I'm going to put my license temporarily on hold so that I can focus on this. But yeah, no, I was teaching and working all the way up until after my book sold.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of authors that we've talked to who, still have their day jobs as lawyers, as engineers, as financial advisors. And, some of them actually really love their jobs. They love both of their jobs, and, power to them. I have no idea how they find the time to meet their deadlines, but yeah. But I want to move into your debut novel. So it is focused on Shek Young, or more popularly known as Ching-Yi, and she has been portrayed in pop culture quite a bit, including most recently Doctor Who and Pirates of the Caribbean, and of course some Chinese dramas in the past. So what was your first introduction to Shek Young? And how have those pop culture depictions influenced your own portrayal of her?
Yeah, great question. So I've been aware of Shek Young as a character for many years now. I think I heard about her when I was a kid. So and I didn't know details about her life, but again, there are stories that are floating around about her. I should say I was born and raised in Taiwan, and so maritime culture, obviously, because Taiwan is an island, it's still a very active part of the life there. But I think, I'm just going to say it. I didn't actually watch the Doctor Who depiction of Shek Young, but I'm going to guess it had something to do with aliens based on just what Doctor Who is about. But I remember watching that Pirates of the Caribbean, I think it was the second or third movie or something like that, and just feeling agog at how racist that depiction of, I think in the movie they called her Madam Ching or something like that, and it was this bit role with no, she didn't really have any substantial dialogue, she didn't have any character development, she wasn't a character, she was a trope, I was 20, I was ooh, it's a fun pirate movie. Nobody writes a novel about pirates without being kind of geekily obsessed with pirates in the first place, And so I was into those movies. And then I remember watching that scene and just feeling really let down. And my 21-year-old, I don't know how old I was at the time, self couldn't really articulate what it was about that particular depiction that rubbed me the wrong way. So when I was approaching the character in this particular novel, I was trying to think about two things. One thing is I wanted to write her from the perspective of a fellow Asian, or well, I'm Asian diaspora, and the other is I wanted to write her from the perspective of a fellow woman, because the thing is that yes, there have also been depictions of her in East Asian media, but I'm going to go ahead and wager that many of those depictions were created by men. And so I think I was really trying to approach her from the perspective of a fellow Asian woman who, certainly my life has been very, very different from hers. She lived during a very different time and in a different part of the world. But I was trying to, I think, tell her story with a little bit more nuance and dignity than how I feel like her story had been told, at least in Western media up to this point.
For our listeners who are kind of unfamiliar with history, can you give context to like what an average woman's life was like during this time in like the 1800s in Southeast Asia, specifically Canton?
I mean, like back then, if you were a woman, then generally speaking, you had very little control over the direction of your life, right? Like if you were a peasant, then you had to work, right? So back then, all genders participated in the workplace, but it was usually kind of really backbreaking, not very remunerative kind of labor. And especially in the case of fisher folk, which she was born into the family of a family of fishermen, you were constantly at risk of being kidnapped by pirates. Like this was a huge problem at the time because that region of the country was going through waves and waves of famine at the time, and so there were all of these like desperate, hungry people who joined pirate fleets in order to get more money and get more food. So if you were in fishing, then there was a very, very the chances of you getting abducted by pirates was not low. Let's just put it like that. And for women in particular, so usually what they did was they would try to ransom you first, right? So if you get abducted by pirates, they'll say, okay, we'll try to see if we can redeem you for money, essentially. But if you're a peasant, you don't have money. Like your family, your village does not have money to give to these pirates. And then so usually one of two things happen. If you were a man, they usually conscripted you into the pirate fleet, and that's how the numbers of a lot of these pirate fleets grew. So it's like if they abduct everybody on a ship, all of the male members of the ship become pirates now. So they get press ganged. And in the case of women, very often, if your families and your communities couldn't pay your ransom, and again, often they couldn't, you got sold into various, to various places. Sometimes you got sold into domestic servitude, and in the case of the main character Sek-young, some historical records indicate that she was sold to these things called quote-unquote flower boats, which was their very kind of like euphemistic name back then for brothel. So I don't know. So I hope that gives listeners some context of what it was like to be a woman back then.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I'm sure you went into excruciating research. I'm just curious, like, as to what your research process was like. Were there sources readily available in English, or was it like mostly you had to dive into like Chinese sources and translate it?
Yeah, there just weren't a lot of written records about her specifically. I mean, there are lots of records about what it was like to about like sort of Chinese maritime traffic back then and kind of the social political situation. About like what was going on with the European powers and with the Chinese emperor. So like those kind of broader societal things were available, and there are many books written about them in the English language that one can easily access. In fact, there was a really, and I wish I remember the name of the author. I'm very sorry. I should have looked this up beforehand. But like, people have written entire dissertations on like pirating culture in southern China, during that period of time. But in terms of this particular historical figure, a lot of the tales about her are oral, right? So it's like they're kind of stories that like have been passed down, but there aren't a lot of written documents about her. And in a way that made it a little bit easier because it allowed me to construct the fictionalization of her life in a way that didn't feel as fettered by, like if there's like a, well-written like biography of her life somewhere, then like I would feel too beholden to tell the story that way. So instead, what I did was I pieced together, I read a lot of books about the general period and the general region at the time. And then I took a lot of these sort of like oral stories that were floating around about her, like these little bits and pieces that, were floating around. And I kind of smushed them, for lack of a better word, smushed them together to make a fictionalization.
Yeah, what I really enjoyed about reading your book was kind of seeing this more, I guess, like you mentioned, nuanced portrayal of Shek-young and the interiority of, I guess, extrapolating what it would have been like to live under what the culture would have been like back then. And we've read plenty of literature about, the effects of Confucius' patriarchal ideals on like women in that time, and like quite frankly, how it like even haunts us today. And so, can you talk to us about how you filled in those details for your main character?
Do you mean like in terms of her personality or in terms of?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. Like, can you tell us about how you, fill in those details, like this character, because, in portrayal, she's always seen as someone like stoic or adventurous. It's a very like swashbuckly portrayal, but her character in your book is much more, we get to see more of her internal insecurities and fears, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, she was a pirate. I mean, I think because there's something so outsized about the way that people talk about her in modern day society. Do you know what I mean? Like people go like, oh, she was this pirate queen. And I mean, I'll be honest, right? Like my marketing team uses that same language when they're pitching the book. So like this is kind of part of the way that we talk about her commercially. But ultimately she was a human being who, almost certainly had all of these complexities. And one of the things that I really wanted to do was like to try to, and obviously, do I know for a fact that these were her complexities? No, like a lot of this is speculation. But I tried my best to kind of approach this. What I would do is I would take the known facts about her life, and then I would kind of say like, okay, psychologically, how would a person who experiences something like this, how would this affect their future behavior? And then how would their future behavior lead to future behavior? So it's a little bit like the analogy that I use sometimes for this is it's like history or historical facts form a kind of skeleton, right? It gives it gives you a skeleton to let you know kind of where all the major battles were and what the major events were. But the rest of it, like the human relationships, the internal conflicts, all of those kinds of things, that they're what you need to do as a fiction writer to fill in the organs, right? Like you need to add the heart, you need to add the blood, you need to add the sinews and the veins. Those are the things that historical facts very often can't. Or we just don't have access to those facts because they've been lost to history. And so in a little bit, it was a little bit like I felt like I was constructing a kind of Frankenstein's monster where I was like taking these historical, these bones, these historical bits, and then kind of like trying to fill the other things in based on my own my own interpretation of human nature and based on my own understanding of things like trauma and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, we talked to author C.B. Lee. She wrote Clash of Steel back in 2021, and it's a YA book on Shek Young and Qingyi Xiao. And in her author's note and in our interview with her, she said that, you know, her own family history helped inform how she was going to write her female characters because, you know, her grandmother actually survived, you know, pirates. Like her family are boat people. And, you know, it really gave her, I guess, the framework to build the character of her female characters. So did you kind of have a similar experience? Like, did you... like, what's your family history and how did it inform you in your writing?
Yeah, so I said I was born and raised in Taiwan. My maternal grandparents actually fled to Taiwan from China back in 1949. So they were part of that huge wave. Sorry, that was an interesting Freudian slip. They were part of the huge wave of refugees that kind of came during that time. And my maternal side of the family, they are big storytellers. I mean, you know, everybody kind of has a slightly different version of like the story, even if it's something that happened to everybody. But so I grew up hearing those stories. And I guess one story that like has always stuck with me was the story that my grandparents told about escaping to. So they were in the southern part of China and they were escaping to the coast to try to get to the boats that would take them to Taiwan. And they got to the shore and there were two boats. One was an old, like one-masted junk ship. And the other was like this big modern diesel-powered boat. And they were like, well, we don't have enough money to get onto this modern powered, you know, diesel-powered ship. So the only one we can afford is this, you know, and when they describe it, they were like, we didn't know if we were going to even make it across the strait to Taiwan because it looked like such a rickety boat. All right. But, you know, like there were people like, because they were trying to escape from Mao's army, they were like, okay, well, there are people behind us. We just got to get on this thing and kind of hope for the best. So the two ships set sail at around the same time. And somebody was apparently firing artillery at the ships from land. And so my grandparents described watching artillery shells fall, like, you know, to the left of the ship, right of the ship, but like just all missing the ship. And then they look over and then the giant boat, because it made for an easier target, had been hit by one of the artillery shells and was sinking. And so the sort of really ironic thing was that this kind of very unreliable looking ship is actually the thing that saved them because it was so small, maybe, that it just didn't make for as easy of a target. And so I remember listening to that story as I grew up and just developing a really weird fascination with junk ships in general. And you know, like, and then as I grew up reading more about these kinds of ships, being kind of like, wow, they were like really amazing ships. Like they were really cool, you know, naval kind of like innovations. And why don't we talk about them more? So I don't know. So that's a little family story that I wanted to share. And so.
Yeah, that's such an amazing story that you just told about your grandparents. I mean, like, I can just imagine like the, I guess the terror that they must have felt at the time, so palpable. But your book is about Shek Young, but also you have another main character. You have Ma Zu, the goddess, and you know, like with all myths and legends, stories about her have kind of been reshaped and retold over time. How can you tell us more about her story? How, like, why did you decide to include her in your book?
The quickest answer to that question is just that pirates back then really worshipped her. Like she was a very, very active, and I shouldn't make it seem like pirates specifically worshipped her, because so many of these pirates were actually fishermen who basically got desperate. Fishermen worshipped Mazu for the obvious reason that she is considered by many to be a sea goddess, right? And so you gotta pray to sea goddess for good harvests or good catches, for fair weather or whatever. So on one hand, it was just like, okay, well, if pirates back then worshipped her, this is a part of the way that they lived back then, and therefore I should try to represent it in the writing. But I think the other part of it is also because, growing up in Taiwan, Mazu is, I don't know if I have the statistics for this, but like, I think she is the most popular deity worshipped in Taiwan. Like, there are obviously many other gods and goddesses that are worshipped, but like, she's considered, the most beloved. And so I grew up, there were like temples, like a bunch of temples in my neighborhood. And I would just go into temples and play with the fortune sticks and play with the moon blocks. And my family wasn't particularly religious, but like, they also weren't, do you know what I mean? They weren't like, no, you can't do this. Like, this is wrong. This is bad. Like, they just kind of let me do whatever I wanted. I grew up around the myths about Mazu. And one of the things I wanted to kind of play with is, there are many ways in which Sekyung herself has also been mythologized by time. And for folks who aren't familiar with the figure Mazu, she might have been an actual person who lived, I want to say like 600, 700, AD or something like that. And over the course of the centuries, she has become this loved and revered goddess. And so I wanted to kind of play with the myths that we tell about women, especially iconic women, and also the ways in which people, including Sekyung, use myths to try to guide their own lives or justify the misdeeds in their own lives, right? Like, there's a way in which myths are, for many people, myths are guides for behavior, or like they provide a certain explanation of the world or a certain meaning of the world that they then use to guide their behaviors. So I was trying to play with some of these ideas about the mythologizing of women in this book.
Yeah, I definitely related to that aspect. There's this, I don't know if it's a strictly Chinese thing or not. Like, my family is also Taiwanese, Waisan by way of China. And we're similar. We're not religious, but we do have superstitions, right? We do have our favorite patron god. Like, for my family, it was Guanggong. So it was because my grandmother, I guess, prayed to the Guanggong shrine before coming to Taiwan. So he kind of became our family's guardian, like, spirit. And there's this interesting way that these Chinese gods work, because it's also part ancestor worship, which is also like a very Chinese religious trait, because similar to Mazu, Guangdong was also he was a historical character that became a fictional hero that became a deified saint/god. So I love that your book explored that aspect of Chinese culture as well.
Yeah, I mean, totally. I have an ancestral altar in my home. Do you know what I mean? This is what I grew up with. So yeah, I wanted to, I wanted to kind of, in many ways, I think this book was also my way of celebrating and talking about these things that I grew up with that I don't really hear a lot about here in the States. Whenever I go back and visit family in Taiwan, this stuff is everywhere. Do you know what I mean? I think it's Monday or something. All the shops have the burner that they put in the front of the store where they burn the paper money, and every store and every house has an ancestral altar in it. And then I come back here to the States, and this is not a thing that gets talked about or thought about a lot here. So in many ways, this book is also kind of it's a love letter from me to some of these these practices that I grew up with.
Speaking of practices, traditions, and superstitions, fortune telling is a big part of your story. And just like the idea of fate and how we, are we free from our fate? Do we get to have choice in it, in our own destiny? But like, this is kind of like a random question, but like, have you ever got your fortune told? Because I feel like every Asian kid has had their fortune told when they were born, or, like before they got married or something.
Yeah, no, I absolutely did. And thank you for saying that, because I think some people might not realize that like this is like a really common practice. When I was like really, really young, like maybe right after I was born, maybe like when I was like 1 or something. You're right. My mother took me to a fortune teller who kind of like she said, okay, I'm just obviously because I don't have memories of when I was 1, but according to my mother, this person said, okay, your daughter may achieve a little bit of some level of like acclaim or something, but when she is 20, when she is 45, like he gave like her 3 ages. And I'm like, Mom, how do you not remember? This is important. But basically he said she might get into bad accidents during like these 3 ages. And of course my mother has forgotten what ages. I feel like this is vital information for me to know. So I know like what year I'm not supposed to, I don't know, get on a plane or something. But yeah, no, she took me to a fortune teller when I was very young. And then since then, like again, whenever I am in Taiwan, I go visit the temples, and I'll like do the thing where you draw a stick and like you pull the little fortune that comes from the drawer, or you use the moon blocks to get yes or no or maybe so answers. And then I've had like a couple of like tarot, like more Western fortune telling styles, like tarot done over the years. But I actually, sorry. I'm going to show you this. Oh, wait, we're not on video, so it doesn't help. But like, I actually ended up buying myself a little canister of these fortune sticks because while I was writing the book, I was like, okay, I think having these would like help me get in the mindset of what it's like to read these fortunes, as well as to be on the receiving end of these fortunes. So anyway. Yeah, it's not a random question at all. I love talking about this topic.
Yeah, I feel bad because I feel like when I go to temples, I'm always following my parents, even as like a full grown adult. I'm just following what my parents are doing and just having them lead me around. So like, I don't know if I'll be able to. I should really next time write down what the things that like are the like the rituals, right? The rituals are something that, as diaspora, at least for myself, I rely on like my parents or someone else to tell me what to do, because I don't know innately what those rituals are, No,
I absolutely hear what you're saying. And it's really funny because I remember when I was doing research with this novel, actually, I went to one of the Mazu temples and I asked the sort of the aunties who work there, like, okay, like give me like the very, like, not what people are doing, but like what you think the official practice is, if that makes any sense. And I remember one of the aunties, she was so cute. She was like, so how, again, this doesn't make sense because we're not on video, but like there's a particular way you go to temples, you see people holding these incense sticks in their hands between their, they sort of like bow to the gods with the incense sticks like directly in front of their faces. And like, I remember the auntie pointed to people and she was like, they're all doing it wrong. And she said that you were supposed to actually hold the sticks kind of like, yeah, exactly. She was like, you're not supposed to just go like this. You're, again, oh my God, none of this is going to make sense in podcast format. But you're supposed to hold the sticks basically directly. I'm trying to describe this. You're holding them directly over your forehead, facing outward, kind of like the prongs of like a tiara or something. And that's how you're supposed to pray with the incense. And so I mean, yeah, like I like if I had followed the way that my parents do it, then it would be wrong according to this auntie, because the right way to do it is like this totally different way. So anyway.
Yeah. I remember, I think That's the way I was taught by. I'm glad my parents taught me the right way, I guess.
As a Korean, I have no frame of reference. I mean, like in Korea, fortune telling is like a big thing, especially like now. I don't know. It just kind of had a like a new surge. Now there's cafes where you can like go and there's like a shaman there to like read your fortune. It's very interesting. Just how like superstition is like weaved into our culture, even in like modern day. But like moving on, I have to say you have a natural affinity for writing action scenes, like the naval battles and like the graphic like violence that you put into your book. Like it's very cinematic. And what I've noticed in the past is that authors who have the skill of writing pretty good visceral action scenes, they've practiced martial arts. Like they have like that background, like Fonda Lee and S.L. Huang. So I'm curious, like, have you ever studied any form of martial arts? Like, where did your, I guess, skill of writing action scenes stem from?
Oh, thank you for your kind words. And I definitely cannot be put in the same category as like Fonda Lee, because I think Fonda Lee has like 5 different black belts. But so I started taking martial arts classes when I was a young adult, and then I continued them all the way into my mid 30s, and then just a variety of life things happened, and I had to stop taking them. But I started with Taekwondo, and then I moved into Okinawan karate, and that's the tradition with which I'm most familiar. I mean, I also, I should mention, I grew up reading my grandfather's wuxia novels. So like all of these like martial arts novels. And so I think I wasn't trying to emulate wuxia novels with this particular novel, but I think the influence almost certainly seeped through, because like I love those books so much when I was a kid. This was before my ability to read Han characters kind of became like, I mean, like I can still read some these days, but like my reading comprehension is far below where it used to be. Yeah, I love those books, and I think I always knew that if I wrote a novel, that there would be some fight scenes in them. So yeah.
I mean, it's a story about pirates. You kind of have to have action scenes.
It feels kind of illegal to have a book about pirates without any action scenes. And yeah, I agree.
All right. So your book releases on May 30th, which by the time people listen to this interview, it's already out. So I know you're in the middle of a lot of book promotion right now, but are you working on anything else?
I am, but it's in such an early stage that I kind of don't feel comfortable talking about it. So sorry.
No worries. You know, you just got your first novel out. Got to focus on the first child first before moving on to the next one. What are you most excited about for people picking up your book?
I think I think that this character Sekyang was definitely not a good person, but I think she was a very complicated person, and I think more people should know about her and her story, and more importantly, I think people should know about this really kind of thriving subculture that existed in China at the time. You know, like I think in many ways, somebody I talked to recently said that this is in many ways a story not just about her, but about that entire community. And so I think that this was a really fascinating community that existed in that area back then. And I want more people to know about it. And so if folks are kind enough to pick up a copy of my book, I hope that they'll find some interesting stuff in there about these people.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rita, for joining us on Books and Boba. It was such a pleasure chatting with you, and wishing you a great book launch promotional tour. Let us know when you're in LA.
Thank you so much, and really, it was a pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you.
Thanks. And that was Rita Chang-Eppig, the author of Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea, available now at booksellers everywhere, including, as always, the Books and Boba bookshop. If you are interested in picking up the book, we encourage you to buy from our online bookstore, where the proceeds not only go to benefit your local bookstores, but also us at Books and Boba. I guess this is a good time to also plug our Books and Boba Patreon. If you want to support us more directly and have access to our Books and Boba Discord and our monthly special Boba chats, you can go to patreon.com/booksandboba and give us your support. It really means a lot to us to have Patreon support, and big thanks to all of our current Patreon subscribers for being part of our community. And I guess before we call an episode, Rita, can you remind us what we are reading for the month of June?
Yeah, we are reading We Have Always Been Here by Lina Wen. And it's a psychological sci-fi thriller about a scientist who must discover the source of her spaceship cruise madness on an icy planet, or risk succumbing to the madness herself. So, like we've said in the past, it is very alien. It is very much The Thing. And this is a pretty short book, I would say, for a sci-fi novel, because sci-fi novels are pretty long.
Yeah, love a good sci-fi horror for this gloomy June we're having. And looking forward to discussing this book with you all. If you've already finished the book, you can tell us what you thought on Goodreads and our new Discord again for our Patreon subscribers. We always love to hear from our listeners, and we love to include your feedback into our book club discussions as well.
Yeah, I like my opinions being validated. So so please share your thoughts in our Goodreads and our Discord. And of course, for the people who are already part of our Discord, I mean, books aren't the only things we talk about. We talk about anime, video games. There's a lot of topics because Marvin and I have a lot of interests. So please feel free to join those diverse conversations that we have on the Discord.
Yeah. All right. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Books and Boba. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you again to Rita Chang-Eppig for joining us on the podcast. And we'll see y'all later. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Books and Boba. This podcast was hosted by Marvin Yue and Rita Yu and edited and produced by Marvin Yue. Follow the book club on Twitter and Instagram by going to @BooksandBoba and engage with us on Goodreads on our Goodreads group. You can also check out past episodes of the podcast by going to booksandboba.com and by subscribing to us on your favorite podcast app. Don't forget, you can support Books and Boba and Asian American authors by purchasing books at our bookshop.org account. Check out the link in our show notes and also at booksandboba.com. Books and Boba is a proud member of the Potluck Podcast Collective, a collective of Asian American hosted podcasts featuring unique voices and stories from the Asian diaspora. Learn more about the collective and check out our fellow Potluck shows by visiting the website podcastpotluck.com. Thanks for listening.
Life gets a little crazy sometimes. Sometimes it's confusing, sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's beautiful, and sometimes it can just piss us off. Enter First of All Podcast. It's a safe space for real conversations about the things that we all struggle with, celebrate, contemplate, and work through in our daily lives. I'm your host, Mindy Chang. I'm an actor, filmmaker, and entrepreneur with a colorful background, a full life, and brilliant friends who I love to unpack life with to share with all of you. They are everyday people like you and me, ranging from award-winning artists, cultural icons, powerful CEOs, my hilarious childhood friends, and even my mom. Tune in for honest conversations on mental health, dating, sex, family, career, culture, and everything in between. Listen to First of All wherever you find podcasts, part of the Potluck Podcast Collective.